happy Hogmanay and all of the wonderful wishes for 2025 to all of you. As always on BookTube, Book Talk, Bookstagram, wherever you are, I feel like the only way to welcome in the new year is to reflect on the year before and talk about the best books you read. So that's what we're here to do. I'm going to talk about my favourite books from 2024, books I read, not necessarily books that came out. Some were new releases, some were much older, and tell you why I love them so that maybe you'll pick them up in the new year. And of course, as always, I'd love to hear about your favourite reads of 2024 in the comments down below so that we can share recommendations. But without further ado, let's crack on with it, shall we? Because there are some stellar books on this list. Alright, so of the books I read in 2024, there were 10 pieces of fiction that really stood out to me, 2 of which are short story collections and 8 of which are novels, and then there were 4 non-fiction titles. So I'm going to start with the novels, get to the short story collections, and then tackle the non-fiction. Aside from that, however, these are in no particular order. I loved them all. But the first one I'm going to talk about is Best Hex Ever. So this is a cozy romantasy, although I will say, along with many people I'm sure, romantasy is a subgenre that slightly confuses me. I think the primary definition of what is romantasy as opposed to fantasy romance or romantic fantasy is that the book is a romance novel that just happens to have a fantasy like kind of backdrop or character to it, and that's what this book feels like to me. This is a contemporary romance novel that just happens to feature some magic, but in a incredibly lovely way that really adds to the atmosphere and that cozy element, and I don't know, it really does add something for me. This book in particular though is about Dina and Scott. So Dina is a kitchen witch. She is from a long line of witches. All of the women in her family are witches, and her magic makes her particularly skilled at cooking and brewing teas. And when I say skilled, I mean that really her magic comes through in that area of her life. She can do magic in lots of different ways. It's her craft, it's her practice, but in particular she feeds it into what she cooks and the teas that she makes, and because of that she runs a cafe, and it is the most cozy kind of magic. It's the kind of magic I love to read about. It's the kind of magic that I feel to some extent does really exist in our world. It's the kind of magic where, you know, you drink this specific cup of tea and it takes you back to one of your fondest childhood memories and makes you feel like you're there again and helps conjure back those feelings. Or you eat a particularly good slice of carrot cake and it gives you that little confidence boost, that little bit of positive energy to go succeed in a job interview, and that's what she does through her cafe with her magic. Meanwhile, we have Scott, who is a museum curator, and he's recently gotten a job at the British Museum, and he's got all these grand plans of exhibits that he wants to do, including ones which involve the British Museum sort of returning some of those artefacts that they got under slightly nefarious circumstances from the past, and sort of building relationships with the international museum community back up from their past. So that's a very moral goal in itself, but he isn't magical, but he certainly would love to believe in magic, and meeting Dina does that for him. They instantly connect when they randomly meet in her cafe, only to later learn that they are in fact the best man and the maid of honour at their 2 best friends' wedding. And there is a reason that they haven't met before now that explains the fact that even though their best friends are getting married, they don't know each other, and they spend the whole weekend together away at this wedding, which is in the English countryside, getting to know each other and falling in love. Except, as the title of this book maybe suggests, there is a hex. There is a hex or a curse on Dina that she's sort of been under since she was in her early 20s, I think, that has kind of doomed her love life, and that obviously puts a damper on things and adds to her nerves about starting up a new relationship. But despite the fact that there is this magic, this literal magic in the book, it is very much interacting with very real kind of relationship worries and how it feels meeting somebody new, and maybe what our expectations are and how we maybe try to hold ourselves back or second guess ourselves, or all of those kind of things. And it's very much tapping into real human emotion and real human experiences with relationships, aside from magic, just in this slightly magical setting. And it is so charming, it's so cozy. There are stakes, there's a curse, there's a hex, but it doesn't feel like superly overly forced dramatic. It just feels like the perfect book to curl up with a cup of tea, you know, a little bit like one Dina might make you, maybe a little cookie, and just disappear into it. It is such a heartwarming book. It was, well, one of my favourite books I read last year, and I am desperate for more books like it, as well as more books by the author. So please do recommend me your sort of cosy, romanticy novels. I'm desperate for more. On the flip side of things, not cute at all, not positive at all when it comes to love or relationships, but incredibly compelling was Bluebeard's Castle. So this is a modern Gothic. It's a contemporary novel set in the current day, but which very, very overtly harkens back to a classic Gothic genre, the classic Gothic tropes of a sometimes naive woman who starts a new relationship or ends up living in a big castle house with a man that she doesn't actually know terribly much about, but she is infatuated with, and how this relationship ends up spiraling and becoming incredibly toxic. And through a very, very, like I said, overt, explicit interaction with those Gothic tropes of your classic Gothic novels from like the 1700s to 1800s to 1900s to, you know, early 21st century. It's both playing with the subtlety of that genre and sort of removing the subtlety. It's an exploration of how, through the romanticisation of toxic love, we can overlook all of the red flags, all of those kind of disturbing tropes, and still fantasize and fall in love with the worst person, and how it can lead to our ultimate demise. And in some ways it's quite a distressing book because to some extent I'm sure many of us can relate to some of the feelings that the protagonist is experiencing, but it's also impossible to put down and so incredibly well written. It's very, very evocative in its prose, it's very detailed, the rich sort of background it's painting, and I think it's an example of how the Gothic genre is still incredibly relevant to our lives, and it's a sort of like feminist take on that. Not to say there aren't like earlier feminist takes on the Gothic genre. And for clarification, because I haven't actually, you know, sort of summarised it yet, it's about our protagonist who, you know, has never really felt a lot of passion in her relationships. She's had an on and off again relationship with the same man for a while, but it's never really filled her with passion. And then she meets this alluring, sort of mysterious man at a wedding away, and they get married within weeks. They travel Europe, they have this glamorous lifestyle, and he buys them a castle to move into. But after they move into this castle and she starts hearing stories about the sad past of its previous mistress, she starts to realise that maybe things aren't as picture perfect as she hoped. And just to add to the kind of like overt sort of expression of ignoring red flags, she's a Gothic novelist in herself, so she's well aware of them. And it's really well done. It would make a fantastic film, which isn't surprising given that the writer is also a film writer and wrote The Love Witch, and I would love to see it adapted. But yeah, this was her first novel, and I think a really accomplished one, and I can't wait to see what she writes in the future. Swapping back to something a little bit more cheerful, we'll see if I can sort of maintain that pattern. The next book on this list is actually a middle grade book, and that is Hedge Witch, and this is the first in a middle grade series, of which I haven't read the sequels yet, but I have picked up book 2, and I'm very, very excited to get to it because this is such a charming little fantasy adventure with gorgeous world building inspired by British folklore that I highly recommend whether you are 8 or 80. This is a children's book that can very much be enjoyed by all ages, but also, you know, delivers what you want from a children's book, which is something that children can enjoy. Like, I think that's really important to emphasise. And it's specifically about a little girl who has grown up the past few years in a boarding school where her mother left her, and she's not seen her mother for many, many, many years. She was promised that her mother would eventually come back for her, but like I said, she's vanished, and She's not very happy at this boarding school. It's quite a miserable existence. It's a common trope of middle grade, shall we say, until everything gets flipped on its head and she meets a talking cat who takes her to a village in the English countryside for her to discover that she's actually from a family of witches. And her aunt, her mother's sister, is actually the sort of like head witch, witch teacher, biggest, baddest, best witch in town that everyone admires, and she ends up attending witch school. Now her mother isn't there, so she's still very, very, very much invested in finding her mother and where she went, but nobody seems to want to help her. Everyone sort of seems to be acting as if it's her mother's own fault. Maybe she got in over her head, maybe she interacted with the wrong side of the magical world, but this is her mum, so she's determined to find her, and whilst making friends and learning magic in this new village, she decides to also sort of undertake the quest of trying to find out what happened to her mother. And like I said, one of the things that's really fun about this is it interacts with some sort of common depictions of British folklore. We've got the fair folk, we've got the other realm, we've got how dangerous the fair folk can be, particularly to children in traditional stories. But it was also just a really fun adventure. Like, the pacing was fantastic, it kept me turning the pages. I loved the characters, I loved our main character as well as her friends. They added some sort of nice interactions and nice balance to the storyline, and I didn't necessarily see where it was going to go at all times, so I'm really excited to see what happens next. Actually, I'm really excited to read book 2, and it was one of the best middle grade books I've read in a while. I hadn't been reading middle grade as much, and this reminded me how much I still really love that age range as an adult, because I think adult literature, even fantasy sort of adventure literature, just doesn't have that same kind of charm that a middle grade fantasy adventure can have. And maybe it's just nostalgia, maybe it just makes me feel like I did when I was a kid reading books for the first time again, but it works, and this delivered. I loved it. I'm just now realising I miscounted. There is actually 9 novels and 15 books in total, which is a slightly nicer number anyway, so that's grand. But the next book on my list is a thriller, and that is Night Will Find You. Now, I actually read a few really good thrillers in 2024, but if I sort of compare and contrast them all, I think this is the one that stood out to me the most and that I would recommend to the most people. It's the most different, I think, in terms of like certain plot aspects. It felt a little bit different from what I usually expect from a thriller, and it's largely because of the main character. Not to say that central characters aren't always important, but it feels like this book is just as much about getting to know her and how she deals with everything as it is the sort of mystery, if that makes sense. And what's interesting about our protagonist is that she's a scientist. She is an astrophysicist, she's an expert in the stars, she is incredibly well respected in her field, and you know, there's all those sort of preconceptions of what it means to be a scientist, but at the same time she is also a psychic, so she never denies the fact that she has some sort of psychic abilities throughout the book. She doesn't use them, it's not part of her career, she's not like a professional psychic, and largely the storyline isn't really a question of whether she really is psychic. This isn't something she's parading around pretending she is to people. She does see things, and she does learn things about those that have perhaps departed or been the victims of crimes, and because of that she has been roped into helping the police. Her brother-in-law is a policeman, and she feels like, you know, she owes something to him, so she gets roped in to sometimes like picking up bits of evidence and telling him what she sees, and she is balancing these two seemingly conflicting personalities. Like, you know, you've got your psychic and your scientist, usually two things that aren't traditionally put together, but they are interwoven so well in this novel, and I love that the author did that. I love the concept that the author took two things that seemingly don't go together and managed to make an incredibly well-rounded, complex character through balancing both of them. Meanwhile, there is a mystery, and it's a very interesting mystery. We have a girl who went missing quite a long time ago, and we have our protagonist sort of feel some information about that girl when she touches one of her hair sides, and ends up getting involved in this case, which then ends up putting her on the radar of a like conspiracy theorist, like alt-right podcaster, which then has its own negative side effects. There's also an interesting new police detective who's a skeptic, who she has to interact with and work with, and balancing all these parts of her life, and I really like that. I kind of like the chaos of how much was going on, and how she had to figure out and balance it all, as well as sort of the mystery of the case. So I really like that. I also really enjoy Julia Heberlin's writing, so I've read a few of her thrillers now, and I find that she really creates a sense of place. Most of her novels are set in the American South, usually in Texas, I believe, and they have these quite claustrophobic, clammy atmospheres in the desert, in the heat, and I feel like I'm there when I'm reading them, and I think that's a real testament to an author's writing ability when they can sort of really transport you to a place, especially one where I've never actually been. So yeah, I really like that about her books, and that was also true of this one. I did also read a lot of contemporary romances that I really enjoyed in 2024, and one that doesn't involve any magic whatsoever, but is no less magical for it, is Whiskey Business. So I have definitely discovered a new favourite author in Elliot Fletcher. This is a contemporary romance set in the Scottish Islands, specifically Skye, which, first of all, I love Skye. I don't think it matters if you've been there or not, but I love Skye, so it was nice for it to be set somewhere I recognised. And we follow a actress whose career has taken a bit of a downward spiral of late, and you learn about how that's happened throughout the novel, so I won't say too much. Whose grandfather has also recently passed away, and she returns home to the island of Skye, to her hometown where her grandfather lived, where she was raised by her granny and granddad, to his whiskey distillery. In a sort of in-between phase in her life, right? She's trying to figure out what's next after this kind of downward spiral in her career, and who is she and what's she doing with her life. So she's gone back home after quite a long time of being away, and when she gets there, she of course bumps in to a young man that she knew when she was a teenager growing up on the island, who worked for her grandfather at the distillery and is now like the manager, who's now in charge of running it now that her grandfather is dead. And they have, you know, that grumpy sunshine dynamic. She's very outgoing, very charismatic, flirtatious, fun-loving. He is a grumpy, isolated introverted islander, but who's also incredibly caring and loyal and has a massive crush on her, of course. So while they do butt heads initially, the story is of course about their romance, and I loved this book. I loved both of our characters. They felt very complex. They both made mistakes, but they were also both very endearing, and you were really rooting for them together, and they made sense as a couple, which was really nice. And then I also just loved the detail. Like, there was so much detail in this book, not least of which about whiskey. I mean, this is set at a whiskey distillery. There's so much information about the whiskey making process, but it never felt like you were being overloaded or being info dumped on. It felt natural. I felt like I was just naturally learning through this book. Even though it was a romance, I was also just learning about things, and I loved the kind of depiction of island life, and I loved that it had those little details specific to Scotland, which I really enjoyed. I'm not an islander, but I still really enjoyed the Scottish setting, and all in all, it was just perfect. I honestly think this was a perfect romance. This is all I could have possibly wanted from contemporary romance, and I would not have changed a single word of it. So yeah, absolute perfection. Alright, but it's not all about romance here, so my next book is one I have talked about so many times this year. I read it in the first half of 2024, and I've squeezed it into every stinking video I've filmed, it feels like, so I'm gonna try not to spend too much time on it here, and that is Lolly Willows. This is a novel from the 1920s, so it's it's sitting on the border between classic and modern classic. You know, it's almost 100 years old now, and it's about a woman in the 1920s, although it begins in the late 1800s, and we follow her through her like young adulthood up into her middle ages, into her 40s, I think, maybe into her 50s, doesn't really matter, in a time when women's roles were, you know, very defined. Women had certain roles they were expected to fulfill, and if they didn't, then, well, they were just like random weird spinsters and nobody could figure them out. And our character, you know, she's done what she's meant to do. She cared for her father. She never got married because she never actually wanted to get married, but that meant she then became like a helper for her sister-in-law and her brother and raising their kids, and you know, she was the helpful aunt that lived with them until she reaches these 40s, like I said, and decides she needs to live her life for herself. But what would that even look like? She's never even really considered what living her life for herself would look like. What does she actually want? And bearing in mind it's the 1920s, what can she actually do? She's from a reasonably well-off background and she still has a little bit of money that is hers and only hers, and she takes this money and decides to move to the countryside where she becomes a witch, because of course, what else would you do? And I love this concept for starters. I mean, I think that it's something that a lot of us could relate to, that desire to just like run away to the countryside and become a witch. It sounds liberating, and it's definitely one of those books which is a reaction to the author's existence and the time in which she lives, and an exploration of how one woman in this novel found her independence and found her liberation on an individual level. You know, it's not like she started a feminist movement, but she found a way to go against the expectations put upon her and live her life for herself. And that was through something associated with women historically that was considered incredibly negative, very antithetical to Christianity, and would have been looked down on. And even when the author was writing this book, it would have been received with some very, very mixed reviews. And it's really interesting reading a little bit more about the author, who was part of sort of like the Bloomsbury group at times, and it was speculated that she maybe was into witchcraft herself. And I like that historical context to it all, and thinking about what the novel would have meant in the time it came out. But I also just think it's a very, very enjoyable novel for modern readers, and I think the themes and the feelings that the main character is experiencing and her desires or something, they're still very, very, very relatable, as is the kind of trajectory that the novel takes. And it's quite quiet and it's quite cozy and it's full of surprises without being like dramatic and wild and in your face. It's quietly surprising and quietly magical, and I really, really loved it. Much, much, much darker in contrast is House of Hunger, which I think is the most disturbing book I read this year. I mean, I have a few horror books and short story collections to talk about yet, but there was some scenes in this one that, you know, had me in the sort of nightmare zone. So for me, this one was the freakiest, but it was also one of my favourites, and I loved it so much that I went out of my way to go to sci-fire.com, is it .com? Sci-fire anyway, and order myself the US edition, because I think the US hardback of this book is so beautiful. The UK cover is lovely, but the US hardcover is so stunning that I had to specifically buy myself a copy to own because I loved it so much. And it's a sort of vampiric novel. It's vampiric thematically, but it's not actually about vampires, but it is about bloodsuckers. But in the same way that bloodsucker can mean vampire, it can also just sort of like mean aristocratic, upper classes, elite in a capitalist society. So it's all of those things. It's set in a society that feels a little bit like 19th century Britain, sort of during the Industrial Revolution, maybe. It's not set in our world, it is set in another world, but it has that kind of historical industrialization setting, and that's what it feels like. And we have our protagonist who's grown up in the slums. She is very, very working class. She is living, you know, sort of on the poverty line, and she takes care of her brother, and she's unhappy. Like that's just the simplest way to put it. She's very unhappy, and what she wants more than anything is to leave this part of the world behind and go to the fancy side of the tracks, essentially. But there's very few ways to become a part of that society unless you become a blood maiden. And a blood maiden is somebody who is basically in the employ, they become an indentured servant of a rich, wealthy, aristocratic family or individual, and donate their blood. So blood is sort of like a prized medicine in this world that the elite drink for all of its health benefits, whatever they are. And while it has its health benefits in this world, it's also a metaphor for, you know, how the upper classes and the elite of society sort of drain and take advantage of those who have less. And our protagonist ends up getting a position as a blood maiden and taking up a position in this wealthy house under a mistress who she ends up developing feelings for. So there are sapphic relationships depicted in this book. There are tense, uncomfortable friendships and allyships, and you're not always sure who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and it's a lesson in being careful what you wish for, and sort of the dark secret underbelly of the rich upper class in a creepy, creepy gothic world. And it's so atmospheric, so creepy. Like I said, I was on the verge of nightmares a couple of times reading this book, and so compelling. Like, you cannot stop turning the pages. You need to know what's going to happen next for the main character, and you're so invested in her story. And I won't tell you what happens, but I loved every minute of it. I thought it was phenomenal. One last romance novel, however, for something a little bit more cheerful, we have Along for the Ride. This is part road trip romance, but I will say it's not set entirely during the road trip. It's sort of half on the road trip, half later. And it's about Jolene and Jason, who do not get on. They've known each other for a few years now because Jolene's sister is married to Jason's best friend, and they've had a few interactions over the years, and they have not developed a friendship. They are just very tense around each other. They don't get on. They don't like each other. They're very different kinds of personalities. Jason is very introverted, he's a perfectionist. He lives his life according to a routine. He likes to do things the way you're supposed to do them, whereas Jolene is outgoing and slightly erratic and impulsive, and they butt heads. However, they end up on a road trip together, assisting Jason's best friend and Jolene's sister, who are moving across the country. So they're moving to another state, and they need help moving their stuff because they've got so much stuff. They end up putting a ton of it into a big moving truck, and Jolene and Jason have to drive that to the new house, which ends up taking a little bit longer than anticipated because of some problems along the way on the road. And unsurprisingly, they have to figure out how to get along, and they figure out that maybe they don't hate each other as much as they thought they did. And it's a novel watching how two people can seem so kind of opposite, but actually really perfectly balance each other out, and figuring out what they like about each other, and actually that maybe they're exactly what they need in each other's life. It's a romance novel. You know what's going to happen. Do I really need to say any more than that? But I really love this novel. It's not the first I've read by Mimi Grace, but I think it's my favourite so far. I found it very charming, very cozy, very comforting, just the kind of book that you can wrap yourself up in like a little warm hug and escape the world for a few hours while you read it. And I didn't want to put it down at all. I think I started it late one night, had to go to sleep, and then finished it the next day because I really just wanted to be there with those characters and see how it all worked out for them. So yeah, I think this was fantastic. Then last but not least for novels, before we get onto the two short story collections, is another horror story, and that is The Eyes Are the Best Part. This is one I think that's going to be on a lot of people's favourite books of the year video because it did come out in 2024 and it's had a lot of hype, but I think it's been very, very, very well deserved. I actually didn't know anything about this book really going into it. I got it through a book subscription service, so like it just appeared on my doorstep, but I'm so glad it did because it was so compelling and really, really well written. Our main character is a student, and her father has recently left home. She lives with her mother and her sister, and her father has recently left her mother. So the same time as her trying to figure out college and fit in with her peers and make friends and figure out who she actually wants in her life or not, and all of the kind of tumult of going to college. We also have the fact that her mother's kind of crumbling without her father and ends up dating this really kind of creepy Asian fetishist white guy who, you know, like, yeah, fetishizes Asian women, and he's dating their mother and making her and her sister feel uncomfortable. Meanwhile, this guy she thought was her friend at university is actually being a bit intense and making her uncomfortable as well. So, you know, she's uncomfortable from all angles, and it starts to devolve. Her feelings start to devolve into a craving for human flesh, specifically the eyeball. And I won't say too much about the twists and turns it takes, but it's a book both about sexism and fetishization. It's the sort of intersection between those two things, the specific kind of racism that is fetishization, and also kind of the expectations that men put on women, and kind of how men get away with things and mistreat women in everyday life, and one woman's sort of broiling, bubbling anger at that towards or in relation to herself and her sister and her friend and her mother, and just how angry she gets at it all and how that, you know, boils up inside her and what that becomes, and it's really well done. Alright, so that brings me to the short story collections I wanted to talk about in this video, and the first of those is Asa, the Girl Who Turned Into a Pair of Chopsticks. Now I think this constitutes a short story collection because it's not a novel, it is 3 stories. It's just not like, you know, 10 stories. I feel like when I think of a short story collection it's usually more stories than that. This is sort of like 3 short stories slash little novellas. shall we say, all sort of thematically tied together by kind of the concept of not fitting in slash not knowing who you are slash dissatisfaction and kind of just existing in the world and trying to figure out how to do that, and a little bit, I guess, of sort of depression and dealing with kind of depression when the world expects so much of you. At least that's how it read to me. I think the thing about short stories, a little bit like poetry, is that it is often open to interpretation to the reader. Not to say that's not the case with novels, but it feels particular of the short story collection. Let me know if you know what I mean, if I'm making any sense. But these are very weird stories. Maybe sort of in the subcategory of sort of like weird girlhood, like I said, kind of existing and fitting in and figuring out who you are and not quite fitting in and not quite feeling right, especially as a young woman. And most of our characters are either like teenagers or in their early 20s, and they all just feel dissatisfied and at odds with the world in a different way. And each novel starts off quite ordinarily, or each story starts off quite ordinarily, like with the first one where the girl just feels done with it all, but then ends up going into a forest, becoming a tree, and then that tree is turned into a pair of chopsticks, and she ends up existing as a pair of chopsticks in this guy's house and finding sort of purpose in this existence of being a pair of chopsticks. And it's written absolutely deadpan. Like, it's not written very tongue-in-cheek at all, but it's so fun to read, fun and weird and a little bit dark and a little bit uncomfortable, but also thought-provoking and imaginative and creative, and each story is a little bit like that, and that's kind of how they're all tied together, but they all have a different plot line. And I just found this very captivating. I find it kind of difficult to talk about, but I also think it's quite relatable. So I think you either get it or you don't, and it'll either work for you or it won't, but I think it was very well done and I'd highly recommend checking out. In fact, if anything fits better with my mug right now, I don't know what does, but yeah, stay weird like Asa, the girl who turned into a pair of chopsticks. And then we have The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. So this is the first short story collection I've read by this author, but I actually have another one on my bookshelf that I am going to be reading very soon because I loved her writing. So the writing in these stories to start with is gorgeous, and it does that thing which I really love in kind of darker, creepier short story collections where the prose is beautiful, really descriptive, very captivating to read, but is actually on quite disturbing subjects, and you get this interesting contrast of like beautiful, captivating, intricate prose with uncomfortable, sometimes quite disgusting topics. And the stories were really quite disturbing. There was like a real mixture in there of storylines, of plot lines, on a range of subjects as well, covering a range of storylines, but like I said, all quite uncomfortable facets of life, about how we treat others around us, how our like actions impact others around us, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, kind of the ghosts of those that came before us, the paths that we retread, and the stories that we never even maybe notice about us. And then occasionally there would just be something so bizarre in here that I would find myself laughing, and it would be disturbing and weird and kind of gross, but also ridiculously hilarious, particularly in one story where there's this ghost baby, which I cannot summarise to you, but I found myself just laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, but in like a really like intentional way. Like I wasn't laughing at the book, I was just like laughing with the absurdity of it all, and also just the kind of like again, deadpan nature of the way it was written, and I just really enjoyed them. I don't know if I'm the most articulate person to talk about short story collections. I liked it. What else can I say? I really liked it, and that's why it's in my favourites. That, however, brings me to the non-fiction portion of this video, of which there are 4. Okay, so the first non-fiction book I want to talk about again is women's lore. 4,000 years of succubus, sirens, and serpents. And servants. This is a really interesting book in terms of structure and how it approaches history and folklore, which I really enjoyed. It specifically, the historian Sarah Clegg specifically looks at sort of one common thread throughout world mythology over time and across place. So we're looking at these sort of serpentine women, and that comes in various different forms. That could be Medusa or the Gorgons with snakes for hair. It could be the Naga, or it could be the succubus who isn't necessarily a snake herself, or it could in fact be Lilith who has associations with serpents. And like I said, just sort of like this serpentine image of a woman who's not always necessarily a snake herself, but who you can trace this connection through, or at least Sarah Clegg traces this connection through cultures. It's an exploration of mythical synchronization, syncretism, which is the phenomenon when sort of like as we move and cross borders and meet new people and new cultures, our mythologies sort of begin to intertwine. And you know, the Romans would refer to the goddess Aphrodite as Venus because that seemed like the parallel for them, and that's what you might call mythical syncretism. And it's a really, really interesting look because it is a look at this one image of a woman who occasionally appears as a protector of women, who is sometimes a danger to women and children, or who later becomes a danger to men and a seductress, and how this thread of this mythological female figure, who isn't necessarily always the same woman, I'm not saying, and Sarah Clegg isn't saying it's the same person at all times, but who has this connection and these shared qualities, means different things to different cultures and different periods, and is impacted by the people who are writing about her, who are worshipping her, who are protecting themselves against her. And it's really, really interesting. I loved that structure, that decision to take one kind of thread in folklore mythology and use it to explore history, and use it to explore kind of what women's fears were, maybe, you know, 3,000 years ago, what women were trying to protect themselves with magic from, maybe what women were being judged for in the medieval era because of reasons they were feared by society, and why women were feared, and how you can learn about all of these different things through this strand of folklore. And I just thought this was a fascinating book. I learned a lot from it. I connected things through it. It made me think about things in a new way, and I'd love to read more books with that kind of structure to them. Remember how earlier I said I miscounted? I did miscount. There was 9 novels. There was not 4. This is chaos. There was not 4 non-fiction books. There's actually only 3 non-fiction books, so there's only 2 more actually to talk about. But that's okay, that's okay. So the next one is Night Terrors. And this is a book of many layers. It's an onion, shall we say, of books. It is kind of part memoir because it's very much the author's own experiences of night terrors and sleep disorders or disordered sleeping. And it's also an examination of what night terrors and nightmares, because those two things are not the same, and sleep disorders have meant to us as cultures throughout history, how they have been used and portrayed in literature, how they have been interpreted by societies. You know, we connect back to, actually, to the whole concept of succubuses and incubuses through the sort of night terror, and I actually love when I read books that seemingly have no connection and end up having little connections like that, which is something I felt was true of a lot of my non-fiction reading this year, and also a little bit about the science behind night terrors. Now, I can't say I've ever experienced a night terror. I certainly get nightmares, but this isn't something I deal with. I have dealt with sleepwalking, which I think is the closest equivalent that's talked about in this book. It does talk a little bit about sleepwalking, but we hear stories of how people sleptwalk into, you know, committing murder in the past. We hear stories of how the author herself processed sort of experience in her life through night terrors, and how they impacted her quite like viscerally and physically. And then we also hear about what she teaches at universities through the literature that she's teaching in her like English literature classes about how, you know, night terrors were used and explored in novels like Dracula, etc. And I thought it was just a really interesting book because, again, it took one very specific topic, it managed to touch on so many different things and tie them all together in a really accessible way, because I'm no expert in night terrors. I certainly don't know the science behind disordered sleeping, and I wasn't really up on this subject at all, but I felt like I learned something and I took something away from it, and it gave me some context to, I think, particularly some of the Gothic literature that I read from the sort of, you know, 20th, 19th centuries, and it also just like got me thinking, and I found it a really, really interesting read. I really enjoyed the personal aspect of it, as well as the amount of different kind of angles it took through this one lens. And then last but certainly not least, for non-fiction and for this video, is Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. So this is actually quite a short non-fiction book, and it's one that's really stuck with me, and I'm definitely going to reread. It was very thought-provoking for being so short, and it had kind of, yeah, it left me with a lot of food for thought, shall we say. And it's a discussion of women, in particular women's sexuality, but also just like more broadly sex in general, but with a sort of feminist approach to it, shall we say. And it kind of examined not just historical ideas around sex and women's sexuality, but also maybe some of the problematic modern ideas we have around sex and sexuality, and how sometimes sex and sexuality can be incredibly oversimplified. The world of sex can also be equally as like negative because it's not thought of complexly, and that's what this book was very much, I think, trying to like dig deep into, was to think about sexuality and sex complexly, because we exist as women in society and we can't sort of divorce ourselves from that existence and what that means for us, and kind of the impact of social expectations and perceptions around sexuality and being a woman on society, and how that can then impact our sex lives. It's very hard to summarise despite being short, because it does touch on a lot of things, and I don't feel like I can articulate them as well as the book itself does, certainly not whilst just speaking randomly at a camera. It's something I'd have to like write down, I think, and explore through text. But it's a book I'd really, really encourage everybody to read, and maybe somewhere in that slush of thoughts that I just spewed at the camera, there is the encouragement you need to go and read it, whether you are a man or a woman or non-binary, it doesn't matter. I think this book you could get a lot from, and it could make you think more complexly about sex. But I'm doing a terrible job of summarising it, and that might also just because I've been sitting here for a really long time talking to this camera now. It's the second video I've filmed and I've been blethering for ages, and I'm starting to like lose train of my own thought. So apologies if that was somewhat nonsensical, but hopefully I've still piqued your interest, because I thought it was a very good book, as were all of the books I talked about in this video. I thought they were all absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, favourite books of the year, what can I say? I'd love to know if you've read any of them. What did you think of them? Did you enjoy them? Did you pick them up because I've recommended them? I love when I can spread the joy of books I love. And then of course let me know what you read in 2024 and really, really enjoyed. What would you recommend that I check out in 2025? Because I am hoping to read a lot more fantastic books in the new year. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.